Live from the mist-enshrouded mountaintop fortress that is X and Y Communications headquarters, you're listening to the world-famous Mountaintop Podcast. And now, here's your host, Scot McKay.
All right, gentlemen, welcome back to yet another episode of the world-famous Mountaintop Podcast. As always, I am your host, Scot McKay. You can find me on just about any social media platform you can think of by searching my name, SCOTMCKAY, at Scot McKay on YouTube, at Scot McKay on Twitter, etc., etc. With me today is a new friend of mine. We were chit-chatting before we clicked record on this particular show. He's a great guy with a whole world of experience. And on top of that, it's experience gained from both Boston metro area and the New York City metro area where he currently resides. He is on the faculty at NYU. He's a love life researcher, and he is the author of a book with a terrific title, Learn to Love, Guide to Healing Your Disappointing Love Life. His name is Dr. Thomas Jordan. Tom, welcome, man.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, man. When I first heard of your work, I immediately latched on to this topic of being disappointed with my relationship, because it's one of those things that I think guys, well, I don't know, I'm pretty sure women fear it also, but I think men are terrified of, well, getting hitched to a woman, getting into a long-term committed relationship, a marriage certainly, or even if they bought a house together or a couple cars or how many kids they've had together. What if I've made a horrible mistake? What if I regret this choice of the woman I've invited into my life long-term? And what happens is I think most people just sweep that entire conversation under the carpet. And if they find themselves in a relationship that they start feeling regrets about, it's almost like they have to panic in private because they dare not say to their significant other, well, hey, you know what? I'm feeling like I settled for you, or I don't really love you anymore, or I never really loved you at all. And this whole can of worms just goes absolutely undiscussed in the entire realm of dating and relationships. It's like a topic that's in the dark until you came along, right, Tom?
Yeah. And I think there's something worse than what you're saying, and that is if the disappointment is repetitive. I've certainly met a lot of people who have told me about repeated disappointments, what you just described happening over and over and over again. And I wrote the book to address that problem because I think there's a way out. And I hope we can discuss it today and give people some ideas about how they can do that.
Well, the obvious way out is to break up or get divorced.
Yeah, but I'm talking about getting a way out of the repetitive disappointment that can get a hold of your love life, where you're making the same mistake over and over again, hoping for a better result. My book talks about what I think is involved in making permanent changes in your love life. I talk about the psychological love life, which is what we have in our minds that shapes our love life experience, what we bring to the party, so to speak. And it's only by looking inside, in my opinion, that we can make those fundamental changes so that what we expect and what we find in our love life becomes healthier and more successful as a result.
Well, I want to dig into all of that, but first let's get some clarity on exactly where we're going with this conversation. When you say people make the same mistakes, that the disappointment is repetitive, is that to say they keep making the same disappointments in choosing partners and then going through this lather, rinse, repeat cycle of getting excited about someone, thinking, you know what, maybe not, then breaking up, and then going through the serial dating or even serial marriage process? Or are you talking about, in fact, within the context of the same relationship, people just being repeatedly disappointed with each other?
Well, all of the above. And what controls this disappointment, repetitive disappointment, is learning. And that's the bad news and the good news. Bad news being that we can learn things about love relationships in our lives. Unfortunately, we learn them unconsciously when they're about love relationships. And that's the big bugaboo. That's the problem, is that people ordinarily, most of us, don't know what we've learned about love relationships in our lives. And we start learning right from the beginning of life. We learn quite a bit in the family of origin. We can learn by observing the love relationships of people in our families. We learn by the type of relationship we have with people in our families. And we can even learn by instruction, elders teaching younger people what to expect in their love life, how to behave in their love life. So all this accumulated learning is very much unconscious. It is in our psychological love life. We don't know what's in there, but it's structuring and it's shaping the type of love life experience we can have. I'll give you an example of it. I saw a woman in my practice a while ago who came to me for depression, and I was getting some history. She was talking about growing up in a home with an alcoholic, violent father who physically abused her mom. And we were talking about that, and then we started talking about her current love life, and she told me that she married 2 alcoholic men who were physically abusive, and she was working on a third. And I asked her if there was a link, a connection between what she had learned growing up and what was going on in her love life. And she looked at me like she didn't quite understand what I was asking. And that helped me understand that relationship between what we've learned earlier in life, what she learned about men, about relationships. And it doesn't have to be a woman toward man or man toward woman. The gender doesn't matter. It's the learning that helps us structure the kind of love relationships we're, and here's the dirty word, familiar with. The root of the word familiar is family. So what's familiar can be healthy or unhealthy, but it becomes the blueprint, so to speak, of what gets expected, what gets created in our love lives.
Well, I think it's a pretty well-traveled concept within the realm of dating and relationships that whatever we see, whatever's modeled to us growing up from whoever comprises our family unit, whether it's a single mom, whether it's a mom and dad, whether it's going from foster care to foster care, we tend to see that as normal because it was normal for us.
Right.
So it becomes kind of comfort food for us. And that comfort food can be
familiar.
Junk food. Yeah. Right. Yeah. As you were talking, I'm not sure whether familiar is the root of family or family is the root of familiar, but either way, it's the same word, right? Same etymology.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And the way in which that learning can replicate the same kind of experience, a little bit different each time, but the fundamentals are the same over and over again. If it's unhealthy, pretty tragic stuff, because I've met people in their 50s and 60s who've recreated disappointing relationships over and over again and gotten to the point where what I talk about in the book, they've reached a stage of resignation because, it can only make the same kind of hurtful disappointment over and over again. And before you start feeling like you got to protect yourself against that hurt, and you start losing interest in love and becoming more defensive when you are in your love life to whatever level you're in it. But the point is that these kind of replications based on what we've learned unconsciously about love relationships can be quite tragic. I mean, I think one of the biggest tragedies in the world, Scott, is you fall in love with somebody and you recreate an unhealthy relationship to contain that love, and you don't even know you're doing so. So what I've realized in my work, and I've been looking at this for just about 3 decades, a little bit more than 3 decades, a lot of information. I try to understand how these patterns get replicated. In the book, I talk about 10 unhealthy relationship experiences that keep showing up in people's love lives that I've witnessed over time. To become aware of replicating patterns, I think empowers people to be able to begin challenging and unlearning the way in which they've dominated a person's love life.
Well, there's 2 factors at play that come to mind here for me that I think would be interesting to talk more about. The first one being this unconscious element of how people gravitate towards what they've always done. And indeed, as I like to joke, we're all born at a very young age. And
right.
The household, the family environment that becomes familiar to us isn't something we choose. It's something that's thrust upon us. And it's something we knew right from the start. It is native to us, whatever that experience or set of experiences is. And certainly people can evolve over time. Some people have tragic things happen where, one or both parents may pass away. There may be a divorce. There's a wrench thrown in the works that disrupts this worldview, and that can result in a lot of psycho-emotional trauma, including a lot of drama at the time, and make things even more confusing because what we thought we knew, somebody moves our cheese, as it were, and now we're on to something else. So I think that familiar element of it, based on something that we don't even know, is becoming normalized within us, I think is one piece. Then there's that element of history repeating itself. And I'm sure these things dovetail into each other. But as you were talking, I could give you example after example of couples who are on their second marriage and someone married the same person basically that they already broke up with.
Right.
It's just same relationship, different person.
Absolutely.
And it seems to me that the pain of affecting potential change seems to bring about more discomfort in their psyche than whatever pain was caused by these toxic relationships.
Well, I would say, I would say that what's in the way is the absence of consciousness. One of our greatest assets, Scott, in my opinion, is consciousness. Once we're aware of something that's operating in our emotional lives, for example, when we can see it, when we can feel it, when we can look at it, understand it, there's an incredible empowerment that comes from that. Of course, that's not enough to make change because now we have to apply the consciousness that we've obtained, that we've gotten to. But it's always the first step. So I think what happens in these tragic replications of disappointment is people don't know what they're recreating. And I use that word recreation in my book because I want to, in a kind of gentle way, introduce the idea that we create these disappointments. We create them based on the blueprint, the learning that's taken place. And that's what I've discovered in my work. And when you can disrupt that learning, when you can utilize consciousness to invite people to look at these patterns and say, look, we got to work on your love life. We work on everything else in our lives. Let's look at this repeating, dominating, replicating pattern because it's creating misery over and over again. Let's stop for a second, look inside, make what kind of changes we need to make inside of ourselves so that the love life we experience is altered permanently as a consequence of those changes. That's the good news. And I talk about in the book the unlearning method as a way in which that consciousness, the first step in that method is always identifying what's replicating, how that consciousness can move to a second and third step. Second step being to learn how to challenge the unconscious learning, to become conscious of it, to look for evidence that it's taking place. I have patients that talk about, in this process, that talk about becoming aware of what kind of partners are no good for them, what kind of partners are good for them, what's unhealthy in the way they behave in their love lives to recreate disappointment, for example, or what they believe about love relationships that might be working against a more successful love life, or even being able to consciously become aware of whatever feelings are guiding a person's love life, familiar feelings that seem to be part of that replicating experience that we're talking about. So when people become interested in working on their love lives, making change, they start to develop what I like to think of as an internal, it's a challenging a part of ourselves that's been dominant and automatic, but now you're shining a light on it. Now you're confronting it. Now you're disrupting its operations. These unconscious learning patterns like to work in the dark. And when you put a light on them, when you're able to see them, you're able to plot them over time, now you can begin to disrupt them and they don't work as well. And now the person becomes empowered to move toward doing something different. Stage 3 is, I think of as a corrective. And the corrective is oftentimes the opposite of what people have experienced in these unhealthy relationship experiences. For example, some people have experienced a form of dishonesty. If you were in a family where dad cheated on mom cheated on dad, there were like the lies that were part of the love life experience that you were witnessing in members of the family. You might have learned that that's an expected part of a relationship, how to behave in a relationship. So it's become an unconscious part. So to seek an honest relationship, to understand the importance of honesty as a fundamental feature of an intimate relationship that takes care of love when love occurs in your life. Now you're onto something that has a potential to change your love life in an extremely healthy and successful direction.
Yeah, it seems like when we shine the light on these blind spots, not only do we gain some insight into what the heck we are doing, we also learn more about who we are, what shaped it. And now that we know how this machine works, having studied it and dug into it and defeated our fear about finding that out, perhaps a little bit of courage.
Absolutely.
Now we can run the machine a lot better. We're more adept skill-wise, not only in relationships, but really, Tom, in most anything, any human endeavor, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mentioned earlier when you and I were chatting before the show about the book that I wrote this book in part because I had changed my own love life, and I wanted to distill some aspects of the experience I had to help other people who were interested in undergoing the same kind of change. And so what happened to me is I grew up in a family with a mom who was very dependent, controlling, and self-centered. And she was all of those things because she was very unhappy. Her parents lived upstairs. She was never independent, never separate from them. And I grew up witnessing those features of her personality and basically learned from her that eligible women were dependent, controlling, and self-centered. And the mysterious part for me was between the ages of 17 and 35, guess what kind of people I found?
The same exact kind over and over again.
And here's what's scarier than that. Even when the women I found weren't like that, I imagined they were because that was what I was familiar with. So I was kind of projecting it on. Until an analyst, a wise old analyst, pointed out to me that I was using something my mother taught me as a template in my love life and experiencing repeated disappointment. So that was very shocking, to say the least, very shocking. I took a break from dating. I looked inside. I talked more about it. I tried to identify the experiences I had in my life that were disappointing so I could map it and get a sense of how this thing was being recreated over and over again. And what happened to me is that during that interim, I realized, and I had some relationships with women in my life who, they weren't romantic, they were friendships, and I learned that women could be independent, not controlling, and intimate, and not self-centered.
How about that?
And I learned that. And interestingly enough, it wasn't long after that my wife, Victoria, showed up. She's an independent, not controlling, intimate, not self-centered woman. And we've been married for 28 years. So I wanted to see if I could put my experience, break it down into something that people could read. And I tried to write it in a way that people could read it easily and begin the process of becoming conscious of what's going on in their love life, working on their love life, so to speak, and start to make these fundamental changes.
Victoria is my daughter Sarah's middle name.
And
it's all intentional.
Yeah.
So basically, she is the princess of winning as Sarah Victoria. And, it's interesting how that's played out already in her young life. My daughter's a multi-time champion in everything she touches and is all about winning and is a competitive spirit. So it's interesting. I've never met a woman named Victoria who was a loser. I'm just saying.
Yeah.
This is a tangential topic.
It's interesting. The name itself could have an effect on the person, right?
Yes, right, exactly. My son's named John. I don't know what that does for him. When I was a teenager, his age, I spent a lot of time in the bathroom, but don't get me started on that one.
Yeah, right.
Anyway, let's go back to your topic after a bit of comic relief there. You know what's really interesting, and you've kind of hinted at this, but I'm sure you're going to have a lot to say. It is so amazing how people are self-centered when it comes to something like a relationship. Like, oh my goodness, my upbringing, my pain, my dysfunction, my principles, and there's another person we're dragging into this relationship.
Right.
And I want your opinion on this because it's never really been discussed from this angle on this show. And I'm, waiting with bated breath to find out what someone with your level of expertise will have to say about this. It seems to me that when someone enters into a relationship with us and our preconceived notions, conscious or unconscious, frankly, one of two things can happen. Either they'll get blindsided by our assumptions and our habitual nature tied up around how the woman in our life has to be this selfish, narcissistic, terrible person who is trying to kill me in my sleep, when really the woman we've just invited into our life is nothing like that. And she's going to feel a little resentful for being thrust into that role. I think that angle is obvious. I think people can readily imagine that. But then there's this truly weird, strange, but extremely prevalent, and I would dare say equally prevalent pattern of people out there who aren't good people. People who are very much like our dysfunctional parents or our narcissistic crazy first wife, who are actively looking for people who will excuse their bad behavior and expect it and allow it, and then they target those people for relationships and we get sucked in. So in other words, those people know they're no darn good. They know they're, sociopaths or whatever. And for example, in the case of the ever popular topic of being narcissistic and selfish, etc., they're looking for people in particular, potential partners who are optimistic and generous because they can steamroll those people. And meanwhile, the people who are optimistic and generous, instead of finding someone optimistic and generous like themselves to have a happy, healthy relationship with, they go, all right, well, I expect all women are crazy and I expect all women are narcissists. So here comes another one. And the person we get into a relationship with in that context goes, perfect. Exactly the way I wanted it. So it's like this can happen to us or it can happen to someone else, depending on who we choose to be in a relationship with. It can go either one way or the other, or perhaps both ways.
Exactly. Yeah. We can find people who are unhealthy for us, or we can behave in unhealthy ways in relation to another. Either one of those.
And we can freely allow ourselves to be targeted and found by someone who's unhealthy and knows it.
Right. In my research, people who find unhealthy women, for example, from the man's perspective, there's a history behind that. They're either caretakers who are trying to fix women. That's very common. Or they've learned that a love relationship consists of a man caretaker who takes care of an unhealthy woman. Broken-winged women, as my college friend used to describe them as. And so there's different ways in which this kind of thing can be learned, but it really produces a form of persistent misery because in my experience, in my research, nobody changes anybody. People change because they want to change. That's a fundamental rule. Anything else is make-believe or filled with resistance and resentment. So if you are together with someone who does not possess the qualities you want and you're trying to figure out whether you should try to make them become the person you want, I would recommend it's time to leave and find the person that you're looking for. An old friend used to describe it as finding someone whose faults we can live with.
Well, I suppose if we're going to come back around to the title of your book, which has the D word in it, disappointing, is it safe to say sometimes when we're so comfortable with dysfunction, such that we seek it, we'd be hard pressed to say we find it disappointing. It's almost like we made this bed and now we have to sleep in it. Then someone finally shines the light on that blind spot and we wake up and go, my God, what have I done? This is not my beautiful house. This is not my beautiful wife, like the old Talking Heads song.
Exactly.
Then
yeah.
it becomes disappointment. Am I onto something?
From the outside observer's view, toxic relationships or troubled relationships that are disappointing, you're absolutely right. The person who's in it might not see it, might rationalize it, might deny it. Outside observers will see the drama, will see the trouble, will see the painful interactions, the toxicity. And that's really, tragic when a person's in a relationship, when two people are in a relationship generating painful interactions and they stay in it or they don't try to change it in a therapy, for example, a counseling situation. But they just accept that that's the level at which love relationships are. And what I find in situations like that is there's a history behind that, Most of the people that I've encountered in my work who settle for toxic relationships have learned that that's all they can expect in a love relationship. And there's a history behind that. So the work with someone like that is to really introduce the idea that there's a lot better out there and to begin to ask questions about that and to introduce that notion, develop it, so people can begin to compare what they have to what they could have.
As you were talking, Tom, it became clear to me that really a third-party observer to a relationship, their opinions really are irrelevant unless they're some sort of clinical advice giver, such as yourself, who would have input that was sought by these people.
Sought. Important word, sought.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Any unsolicited advice, us interlopers or bystanders or onlookers may give someone about their relationship really isn't worth 2 cents. What I'm reminded of is one of my favorite authors of nonfiction, who is actually a rather obscure writer nowadays. His name's Mill Millington out of the UK. And he wrote a book called Things My Girlfriend and I Have Argued About, which is probably one of the great works of comedic fiction I've ever read, except it's semi-autobiographical because it's based on his real-world relationship with his long-term girlfriend. He and his girlfriend argue constantly. They bicker and banter about everything nonstop 24/7. And one of the charming things about that book is you realize they adore each other. They both love arguing. They both love contesting each other. They think it's just great and big fun. And everybody looking at them from the outside is like, man, you two, you guys have problems. All you ever do is argue. But really, they're soulmates. I think this theme was kind of co-opted a bit by the TV show House, where, Dr. House and Cuddy, his ex-wife, were always kind of flirting and still hot for each other, even though they were constantly arguing and backbiting each other. So there's this element that I think we probably should discuss where, if the two of you aren't necessarily being dysfunctional with each other, but you've just found someone who's exactly like you, how do you differentiate that from something genuinely toxic? Let's define toxic.
Well, my first impression is it sounds intimate.
Oh, it is.
People can have this kind of banter and enjoy themselves. And there's a bunch of other things people can do together to enjoy themselves that looks like it's not so healthy to others. But I think that the feelings that are generated from that activity will determine whether or not it's healthy or not, or it's intimate or not. I mean, people can fight in a way that's toxic, that says, no, this is not about intimate soulmating. This is about people who are angry and hurt and deciding to hurt each other.
It's intent, isn't it?
It's intent. It's experience. But what you're talking about, I mean, I have ways to play with Victoria. I mean, I know that I can say certain things to my wife and she'll have a certain kind of reaction, and from time to time we have an exchange about what I've said, that she'll remind me, she'll remind me from time to time that I'm reenacting the influence of my brothers or my mother or my history, and it's all done in fun,
Right. This is to the great entertainment of both of you.
Right. Exactly.
Yes. My wife and I are not unlike that. My wife and I trust each other to the ends of the earth because I don't know if I hit the jackpot or how exactly well I engineered this, but I got to know a lot of women. I got to know what I was really like and what I appreciated in the female mind, and started trusting that women aren't another species. They're actually still human.
Right.
So when I met a woman I found incredibly attractive, who I knew what was going on inside her head, I trusted her. I didn't fear her. And, it's been said that fear is the opposite of love. You get rid of all the fear, you fall in love. And, my wife and I are a safe place for each other to vent. I mean, sometimes we just get our rocks off. Like, I have had it up to here with this, and raising our voices and blah, blah, blah. And then there's no hard feelings afterwards. Yeah. And it's really strange because we have friends in our lives, not in our immediate family, but people who drop by and visit. And we're not artificial when those people are here either. I mean, one time I just let my wife have it in front of her best friend. Her best friend just basically said, okay, well, here they go again. And just basically let me finish. It was something having to do with finances and insurance and how dare you? And well, how dare you? And, we were done and she was like, anyway, can I pour you another glass of wine? Yeah, sure. I went somewhere. She goes, see you, Scott. Her friends, it looks dysfunctional on the surface, but it's that we don't fear each other. It's the ultimate trust.
You mentioned, yes. And that word is a powerful word. That's on the list of intimate elements, intimate features, things that occur in an intimate relationship that preserves the love that you feel with each other. So if there's trust, that's very powerful. That in and of itself, it's sort of it neutralizes these funny moments, keeps them from being hurtful, and makes them experience the two of you have that's playful, enjoyable, sometimes informative, but you're not there to hurt each other. And the trust establishes that. So that's important.
Yeah, Tom, there's one topic that if we don't address it, these guys are going to come at me with torches and pitchforks because I think it gets right at the biggest fear, the biggest concern that guys bring to the table relative to this topic at large. And that's, how do I make sure I marry the right woman? How do I make sure I don't settle? And I'm sure a lot of the guys who've listened to this episode thus far have already drawn the conclusion, you know what, if I marry the wrong woman and I settle for someone I'm not even attracted to and I don't even like her, that's my stinking thinking from the early stages of my life talking. I've been taught that, even unconsciously. It may even be a blind spot. Mm-hmm. My old man was disgusted by my mom and vice versa, and God knows how they ever got married because they couldn't stand each other, but that's what I grew up with, and, life's a bitch and then you marry one.
Right.
That's what I've been taught. Meanwhile, I have these friends who are on a perpetual honeymoon with this gorgeous woman who just giggles and treats him right all the time. And he just adores her and she just adores him. And somehow there's this nagging feeling in my life, saith these guys out there, that I don't deserve that. That's all for some other guy. I'm not particularly tall, dark, handsome, rich, or, insert limiting belief here, right? So I don't deserve the kind of woman I really want. And so I guess I better get used to being with someone I don't really want. And I'm going to tell you what I think about this, and then I'm going to let you riff your brains out on it, okay?
Okay.
I think the only thing worse than settling for someone is being settled for. And when we're arrogant enough to draw someone into our life who we didn't really want, first of all, that's not fair to them, right? Mm-hmm. It puts an undue burden on them. It also robs them the opportunity to find someone who would have appreciated them a lot more than I would. So it's almost like this self-flagellation, not to be confused with self-flatulation, right? That is completely unnecessary. So how do we as guys shine a light on that mindset and do something about it that's 2020 foresight instead of having to go back and muck this thing out after we're already married to her?
Okay, let's get one of the complications off the table right away.
Sure.
I don't deserve a better relationship than I currently have or could have. That statement in and of itself is a big red flag, a big flashing light. That's number one. We have to get that one out of the equation, because when people are struggling with this feeling like they don't deserve the good things in life, the healthy things in life, there's going to be a story behind that. There's going to be some learning behind that. There's going to be some issue that needs to be looked at before you start dating, before you get out there. That's something that involves the individual. That's inside the psychology of a person. So it needs to be looked at. And that kind of negativity has to be, in my opinion, cured. And once that's cured and you stop feeling like you deserve the good things in life, it's a little bit of luck and a lot of getting out there, then the next step, of course, is falling in love. And that's something you can't control or predict. It's going to happen. Hopefully it happens to us more than once in our lives. Hopefully it'll happen when you're ready for it. But the point I'm drawing on is that it's an unpredictable, uncontrollable, wonderful experience that we have. So we fall in love with someone. Okay, what happens next? What happens next is very, very important. And I in the preface of my book, I wrote, this is not a book about love. This is a book about love relationships. Love we can't do anything about. We can't control it. It's one of those things we still can't control. I hope we never can control it. But the kind of relationship we set up when we fall in love, that we can do something about. So some guy has fallen in love, and this is the woman that he's obsessing about, he's thinking about her, he needs to see her, he needs to know her. The next step in that process is getting to know who that person is, and they're getting to know you. So there's a relationship forming, and being able to determine whether that relationship is healthy or unhealthy. If a relationship forms and it's unhealthy, either on her part or your part, that must get your attention. It must be a moment where you're able to reflect and say, this is not working out, because the love is there, but the relationship is unhealthy. And there are people, unfortunately, who are out there, want to be in love, want to be in a love relationship, but their issues, their relationship issues, keep them from doing that in a healthy manner. And in my opinion, they're not ready to be in a love relationship. They're not ready. The important word is ready. Ready means that you can set up a healthy love relationship when you fall in love. For example, a common example, I fall in love and I'm an insecure person who has to control the woman or possess the woman I fall in love with, because intimacy and love scares me. So I got to control her and possess her. Possession and control features of an unhealthy love relationship that is going to destroy the love that I'm feeling. Trying to control your partner, possession, control, and believe me, I've heard some horror stories about that kind of thing, indicates to me that that man is not ready for a healthy love relationship. He has some work to do within himself. And that pre-work, that work, curing that insecurity, taking a look at its sources, trying to understand what's scary about intimacy, answering those questions, asking those truthful questions about oneself. That's the preliminary work, and it doesn't have to take 20 years. It can happen with openness and receptivity to oneself, soul searching, questions, journaling. There are multiple ways to be able to deal with one's own issues regarding how you might end up forming an unhealthy relationship. So the important point is that you fall in love. The next step is the kind of relationship you're setting up or is being set up with you. If you, for example, let's do the other side just for illustration. If you fall in love with a woman and it's wonderful and you begin dating and you want to deepen the relationship, you're ready for a healthy relationship, you've done some preliminary work on yourself, you're at a point in your life where you say you've corrected some things in your mind about what went wrong in your previous marriage or previous relationship, and now you're ready, and you're ready to enter into an intimate, healthy love relationship, but your partner is unavailable emotionally at times. Goes away, comes back, goes away, comes back. It doesn't seem to be able to stay in one place to allow the relationship to progress, develop, mature. That's a problem. That's a problem that needs to be understood in the form of, I fell in love, but the relationship that's being formed with this individual is unhealthy. Because that kind of relationship can lead to a situation where a person is not committed, a person is unable to sustain intimacy. So it's going to be heartache if allowed to endure beyond a certain point. So my advice in a nutshell is to become carefully aware of the type of relationship that's forming when you fall in love and being able to make a decision whether or not that relationship is healthy enough to sustain the love that you feel. And, I want to be clear, too, with whoever's listening to this, that if you fall in love with someone who can't be in a healthy relationship with you, that is a very difficult situation because that chemistry, that falling in love part is very strong at times, and being able to walk away from a relationship that's unhealthy because in your heart, you've seen it over time, you've dated a person for a while, you know that the relationship is not healthy, you can't change that individual, that's not going to happen. And you reach the point where you realize, no, look, I think I need to walk. I think I need to go. It's not going to end up well. It's either going to repeat something I've experienced before, or I'm going to become part of a scenario with this person that's painful and hurtful. That is a very difficult decision to make, but I believe that if you've been in it for a bit, you've dated for a while, you've seen that the relationship being formed is unhealthy, it's the healthiest thing that you can do for your love life.
It's funny. My wife, Emily, who is obviously a world-class dating coach in her own right, these guys know this, she goes against the entire world of dating advice by saying you can choose who you fall in love with. And she's not talking about the emotional part. She's talking about applying logic to that. In other words, if I'm going out on a date and I'm getting the touchy-feelies with this person and I'm getting emotionally attached, but this person's no darn good, I can exercise self-discipline and walk.
I agree with her.
Later.
I agree with her.
Right.
I agree with her.
My G-rated version of what I say in response to that is don't just find a pretty face, find a pretty face who treats you right.
Treats you right.
That's
right.
what
there you go. There you go.
You also mentioned being one half of a great relationship before you can expect to have a great relationship.
Exactly.
And again, I think that gets right to the heart of the matter of people feeling very selfish nowadays in general about relationships and feeling like I should get what I want without having to really put in the work in return.
And you know what I want to say? You know what the problem is there is that people oftentimes, and I mentioned it a little bit earlier, people oftentimes fall into this notion, I've fallen in love with you, I want this to work, I'm going to love you to death and make you right. I'm going to love you to death and change you. I'm going to turn you into the person that I need. And it's so easy to fall into that pit. And it's a pit because it never works out. In 35 years of being in this field, working with people's love lives, I've never encountered a person who said to me, I tried to change my wife, I tried to change my husband, and it worked. They became the person I wanted. Instead, I've heard many, many stories about resistance, many, many stories about resentment. You don't accept me for who I am. I resent you for that. That's what happens. So it's so easy to fall into that. That's one of the great defenses of the love life field is the effort to try to change someone because you've fallen in love with them. You see they have positive qualities in a certain area, but there's things that are going on in the relationship that are fundamentally unhealthy, and you know it's going to end up bad.
You know, for 17 years now, Tom, I felt like the proverbial voice crying out in the wilderness over here with my tagline that's also the URL of our main website, which is deserve what you want.
Deserve.
There's so much talk about getting what you deserve, but what about doing the self-work to be the best version of myself so that the kind of woman I want also wants someone like me? That seems to me to be the essence of this whole thing, which is a great place for us to kind of end this conversation.
Beautiful.
His name is Dr. Thomas Jordan. He's in New York City. He's a clinical psychologist, a love life researcher, and the author of the book, Learn to Love, Guide to Healing Your Disappointing Love Life. You can find it on Amazon by going to mountaintoppodcast.com/Amazon. And I'm going to put Dr. Jordan's book right at the top of my Amazon influencer queue. And when you go to mountaintoppodcast.com/Jordan, you will be teleported automatically to Dr. Thomas Jordan's website. And Tom, what will they find when they go to mountaintoppodcast.com/Jordan?
They'll be teleported to lovelifelearningcenter.com, which is the name of my blog website. It's been up since 2012. I wanted to put together a love life library, so to speak. There's over 300 articles there about real issues in the love life area that people can learn from, that people can understand and apply. And there's also information about my wife and I. We offer love life consultations by phone for anybody who wants to enter this change process that we've described today that could use a little support and guidance. My wife is also a clinical social worker and psychotherapist, so we do these consultations separately, but she and I have worked together for over 28 years now.
Fantastic. So guys, indeed, go ahead and visit mountaintoppodcast.com/Jordan and find out all about Dr. Thomas and Dr. Victoria. Thank you so much for joining us today, Tom. This has been a fantastic conversation. I know my audience really particularly appreciates guests who know their stuff, and you've brought your wisdom to us in spades today. And I know I appreciate it. And I'm sure the guys do too. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Scott. Thank you.
Thank you, man. And guys, as I always tell you, be sure to visit mountaintoppodcast.com. Now, we're doing master classes. We got the brand new program, Unsettled. If you feel like you're kind of stuck where you are right now and you've got a long life left to live and you just keep feeling like you're getting up tomorrow and doing the same thing you did yesterday, well then, gentlemen, Unsettled is for you. Go to mountaintoppodcast.com/Unsettled. Master classes are on the last Wednesday of every month, and we leave nothing on the table. We hit a topic that is central to your success with women. Every month we hit it hard. We hit it completely. There are no disappointments. You can find out what the next one is upcoming and even get your hands on past editions, which are there for you, immediate gratification style in members areas for everyone we've ever done. You can visit mountaintoppodcast.com/masterclass and learn more. Also want to thank our sponsors as always, Origin in Maine, Hero Soap, and Keyport. When you go to mountaintoppodcast.com, you can learn more about all three of those sponsors and use the code MOUNTAIN10 to get an additional 10% off any purchase. And until I talk to you again real soon, this is Scott McKay from X&Y Communications in San Antonio, Texas. Be good out there.
The Mountaintop Podcast is produced by X&Y Communications. All rights reserved worldwide. Be sure to visit www.mountaintoppodcast.com for show notes. And while you're there, sign up for the free X&Y Communications newsletter for men. This is Ed Roy Odom speaking for the Mountaintop Podcast.